Hello and welcome to the Society for One Place Studies monthly hangout. I'm Julie Goucher, I'm Secretary for the Society. Before we kick off today, we have got some space in the room if people want to join us. The invitations have been posted live, but it's just taking a little time to come through. In the meantime, we do have a couple of things on the Society website. We've had a new blog post go up, I think, in the last day or so, and we've got Janice's course coming up, so please just go and have a look at the member offers and benefits. Tonight's session is around education and school days, and I'm going to hand over to Kim and Kirsty, who are going to run through their presentation. So over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Julie. Julie is incognito behind the OPS sign tonight due to technological problems, or technical problems I should say, and I'm having technical problems with my bottom third, because otherwise you end up with me in a very weird way. So for those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Kirsty Gray and I chair the Society for One Place Studies. My One Place Studies are down in Devon, as all of the people in the room have a certain number of studies down in Devon. So mine are Tetcott and Luffingcott, and they're right on the border with Cornwall, but I won't be talking too much about those because Kim's going to tell you quite a lot about the records for schools and how they relate to a one-place study, whereas I'm tasked with doing the more general information about how education has evolved over the last 2 centuries in England. We did say in the blurb that we sent out prior to the hangout that this is British-centric, because that's what we know, and we're hoping that other people who are in the community or join us in the hangout can tell us a little bit more about education in other parts of the world. So I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully successfully. There we go. Oh, I think I've just clicked out of it. There's a good start. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay. So first of all, it's important to consider what school was like before Queen Victoria, because although there had been schools dating back as far as the 6th century, many Victorian boys and girls didn't have the opportunity of going to school at all, and it wasn't really until Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837. At that point, education was still really perceived as mainly for the privileged. Rich children had a governess to teach them at home until they were old enough. If they were boys, they might have gone to a public school, maybe like rugby school, which was mentioned in Tom Brown's School Days. And it wasn't really until Queen Victoria came to the throne that actually the poorer children had even the opportunity to go to school. There were different kinds of schools that Queen Victoria actually brought in. In fact, the Dame schools were around a little before Queen Victoria. This Dame school was actually built in 1780. It's a little bit derelict now, but this was built in 1780 by yeoman farmers up in Raisbeck, and it was repaired in 1857, converted for a use as a house later on in the 20th century. You can see it's obviously incredibly small. And Dame schools, as they were called, were schools really for very young children, and they provided a very, very basic education. In some cases, the children were really just looked after and not taught at all. It was for the poorer people within the communities who had to work, and they pay a small sum of money for the dame, hence the name Dame schools, to look after their children. It was sometimes nothing more than glorified babysitting, really. But it was popular with the working class parents, and the schools persisted actually until the end of the 19th century. And there were charity schools. Charity schools were run by religious or philanthropic groups. Some were set up by local landowners or maybe clergymen, and they were run in private homes or church vestries, like this one that you can see on the screen there. Others were financed by sort of charitable trusts, and some actually charity schools still exist today, but very few. They were mainly concerned to educate children in the knowledge and practice of Christianity, and to prepare them for apprenticeships and jobs like domestic service and things like that. This charity school that's pictured here is actually still open. It was originally called the Bliss Charity School, but it's now Nether Hayford School. Some of the older schools were established a long time before that, and this school is one of the oldest established schools, which is Wolverhampton Grammar School, founded a long time before Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1512 by the Merchant Taylors Company. And a lot of these older established schools are found in bigger towns, kind of like Wolverhampton. During the Victorian period, many of these moved to sort of suburban sites to attract pupils from some of the more middle-class families who were moving into the new suburban housing developments. So most people will know that children actually were sent out to work quite young back in the day when Queen Victoria was on the throne, back in the days when she was on the throne, and a lot of them would only actually be educated on a Sunday in Sunday schools. Now, Sunday schools were established from around the 1780s, again slightly before Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, and they taught basic literacy, numeracy, and surprisingly, religious education. Some of the buildings provided were quite substantial, and by 1851 there was some support from what was known as the Sunday School Union, so some sort of funding from the Sunday School Union. This particular building here is a Grade 2 listed site, but it's quite obviously at risk. It's a Victorian Methodist Sunday school in the Potteries area in Burslem, or near Stoke-on-Trent. So you've got Dame schools, charity schools, some of the older, more established schools, and Sunday schools. Now, most of the children actually worked in factories, or if they didn't work in factories, their parents had to work in factories. Now, this one is in Saltaire, still standing, and this is the former factory school in Saltaire, which is now the Shipley College Salts building, which was opened in 1868. And this was built especially to educate the children of the workers of the factory. So children who were sometimes educated in Sunday school, they may have had a part-time job in this factory, or they may have just had part-time education, as I mentioned, if their parents worked there. There was some legislation in the middle of the 19th century limiting how long children could actually work. There were Factories Acts to limit how long they could work, and some of the industrial schools later incorporated into the local authority system. So the term kind of industrial schools referred really to factory schools as well as industrial schools. And some were built for sort of pauper children who were then given reading and religious education skills, as well as spinning, sewing, or cobbling to give them a trade that they could then work in. There's a picture of what the schools might have looked like, and the British schools certainly were taught with boys and girls separated. You can see no girls in that room at all. All of the boys are in fixed rows of desks facing the master's desk at the front, and sometimes actually these separate rows were for different standards, so different levels of ability. It wasn't necessarily age related. It was more whether they passed a particular standard in terms of educational level, and that actually became a word that was used to describe a particular class within a school. So those wide aisles, well, not particularly wide aisles at either end allowed some monitors, or obviously the master if he wanted to go up, or mistress if she wanted to go up the aisles. But there were monitors which were sort of the older pupils, and I think in this picture some of the children standing around the outside may have been perhaps the monitors that were actually supporting the education of some of the youngsters in the room, perhaps. There's another type of school that's actually a national school, which provided separate schoolrooms for girls and boys as well, but I won't talk too much about that. Now, school attendance to the age of 10 was only made compulsory in 1870, and even, as I say, then it was only up to the age of 10, so children didn't have to go to school before 1870. But by the time 1870 came around, you had to be in school up to 1870. but secondary school remained dominated by public, the kind of the fee-paying and grammar schools. I've just popped up here, this is a logbook for a particular area that I have family, it's not my one place study, showing just at the bottom there, attendance greatly improved the last 3 days of the week. So you can see that actually there are lots of different things that actually impact on the attendance. If you look right from the top, in fact, Tavistock Goose Fair, this is Peter Tavy, which is very close to a slightly bigger town of Tavistock down in Devon. Tavistock Goose Fair, attendance very bad, especially amongst the boys, on the 12th of October. So they were obviously being used for other things on those days. And you can see on the 19th, Mr. Collins visited the school yesterday and took particulars of attendances made by certain surnames, with a view to their parents being summoned for their irregularity. So parents were actually summoned to the school to explain the irregularity of their children's attendance. The head teacher actually at a different school in the middle north of Devon, at Chilsworthy School, on the 16th of December 1930, wrote, Harold Siliphant, that's my one name study, Harold Siliphant sent home at 1 o'clock accompanied by his brother Willie, having badly cut his head while playing. So these logbooks are amazing just for information about what actually happened with the particular characters within the village, whether it's parents being summoned or whether it's particular individuals cutting their heads or whatever. And an entry in the Wesleyan School logbook in 1890 actually gives an indication of some of the reasons why children might have been away from their desks, and there were some rather amusing ones. In 1889 and 1890, the school recorded that F. Badcock had delicate health, W. Rees, sickness, J. Ford, employed, T. Wicks, sickness of sister, and W. Siliphant, a liking for wildlife. So I'm not entirely sure why that meant he wasn't at school, but clearly it was a reason for his absence. This is the front of the Chiller National School in Black Torrington. So the national schools, as I mentioned, are a slightly different type of school again. They had separate schoolrooms for girls and boys, and desks were placed sort of around the walls rather than in rows like in the picture a couple of slides ago. And in the national schools, pupils were actually taught by monitors in those groups, probably of about 12 to 24, something like that, either standing up or on benches. So they could be rearranged to kind of suit the lesson that was actually being taught. The national schools kind of favoured a larger schoolroom, so they could accommodate hundreds of children within one large room, and it became quite common for a master or a mistress, as you can see on the screen there, to actually employ quite a few pupil teachers within the school. So here you can see the masters and mistresses, which is in the front of all of the I forget what record it is now. I've lost the what's the word? Admission. The admission, progress and withdrawal book, the register for those. All of those on the front inside cover actually have that recording the masters and mistresses. So again, a very useful way to see how times are changing. Maybe it was a master for the first, well, it was in this case, for the first 4 years it was a master, mistress, Mrs. F, I can't read what the other one says, and then William Garrett Jones, and then lots of mistresses, and then we're not entirely sure unless we delve deeper into A. Isles and E. Clements as the years go by. But there are lots of other school records, which Kim will go into in a moment or two, that you can get from your particular area, whether they be attendance records or class lists, punishment books even, so you can find out how naughty or nice the particular characters were in your village. Honours books, so particularly good work and honours that the children might have been given, awards and such like. Accident books, and all of those things will reveal further details of your ancestors' school life. I've just put one small part here of the admission, progress and withdrawal record, because they mostly will give a date where the children actually joined the school, the name of the child, the date they left, and their next of kin, if you like, but usually a parent or a guardian. And then it's quite a long book, and then on the other side it'll tell you their progress within the school and the reason for them leaving, which is quite an eye-opener as well, when it says had to go to work or moved to London or went to a private school or whatever. So that's really enlightening as well. So the records are generally held in local studies libraries or the county record office, or whatever name they decide to call it now, Heritage Centre Studies, blah, blah, blah. And in the case of church schools, they're sometimes in that particular denomination's archives. So you can work out where your ancestor may have been educated by consulting the contemporary directories. Access to archives for England and Wales is an excellent online resource which gives the facility to search and browse for information about collections of records, but it's only got 30% of the catalogues for English and Welsh repositories, archives and so on. So it may be that you do actually have to go to the specific place that you're looking for, the local archive, and search in a little bit more depth. The Find My Past are actually, they've been working this year since October 2013, in fact, but for nearly the last year, on putting millions of school records online. So there's a huge host of them. I've just pulled off a couple. Glamorgan school admission registers from 1768 to 1911, Manchester industrial school registers, Manchester school registers, and Ancestry also has the London school admissions and discharges from 1840 to 1911. And I've missed out a whole host because I would be here until 9 o'clock on my own just listing those. I've listed just a couple of books that are very useful there in terms of further reading, and I'd certainly recommend the most recent publication on the bottom there by Pamela Horn, The Victorian and Edwardian Schoolchild, which is an excellent read. So just a couple there. Ancestral Trails is quite a general one which gives you information about other things as well. Colin Chapman's British Education book, but I mean, very little has changed since 1992 in terms of the history of the British education, but obviously there's a lot more that's become online and more available, and Pamela Horn's book is a little bit more up to date with the recent changes in digitisation and so on. So just a couple of things for you to consider. So I think on that note, I'll stop talking and I will pass over to Kim. I'll just unshare my screen. And I'll pass over to Kim, and Kim can explain a little bit more about how she's used her records for the schools in her area. Bratton Clovelly is her study, and she'll tell you a little bit more about how she's used those in her one-place study.
Thanks, Kirsty. Are my slides showing now?
You certainly are.
Okay. My name is Kim Baldacchino. I'm studying a rural parish in the southwest of England called Bratton Clovelly. And as Kirsty said, I'm just going to show you a little bit more specifically about what I found in my parish in the hope that either later in this hangout or afterwards more people will share what they found that's similar or different in their own places, whether in England or elsewhere. I want to look at these examples to help folks to understand the sorts of things you might learn about the schools and from the school records. And it's really quite a variety of sources you can use. I focused on what I'll call the public schools of Bratton Clovelly. There were some Sunday schools, but the records are really piecemeal and pretty hard to find, especially the nonconformist records. But these schools that I've shown here, the National School that was built in 1837, the Board School that opened in 1875, and then the present-day school, which, although it opened in the, actually probably started back in the 1800s, but really came into use as the main parish school in 1961 when the board school closed. I'm going to focus on these, and most of the records are associated with this board school up in the right-hand corner here. So I'll just briefly touch on the early school as well as the present day school. Okay. Okay, let's start with this national school. And interestingly, Kirsty, this national school is slightly different than the later ones you described. This was in operation from 1837 to 1875. It housed about 40 children and was open to boys and girls and just consisted of one room. I haven't found any of this type of school records that Kirsty was talking about for this school, and frankly, in those days, there weren't requirements for the school to maintain such records. But you can still find out an awful lot starting this early. I think the first recommendation I'd make is to spend some time getting the context of the schools. The history of public education in England is really interesting, and it came into the forefront at about the same time as a lot of the other reforms in the early 1800s, as Kirsty described. What was interesting was there was a lot of controversy over the possible impact of educating the masses, and the church was a key advocate in the discussion. You can find all this stuff online. Just do a search on Google. I happen to like a little one called educationengland.org.uk, but there's lots out there. What's interesting about that history is what I have found on my national school is the original indenture, whereby two farmers in the parish actually, for a nominal fee, gave a small piece of wasteland to the rector and curate and church wardens of Bratton Clovelly, and it was expressly for the purpose of building a schoolroom and educating the poor children of the parish. So it's right in line with the sort of movement that the church was advocating at that time. The building itself may also exist, and if it does, I think you'll probably have a pretty high likelihood of finding a photo of it online if you're not able to visit the parish yourself. But take a close look at that building. In the case of this national school, it still sits right in front of the church in Bratton Clovelly. It has a plaque on it for 1837. On the side, it's got, I'm sure you can't make this out, but it's got a plaque that identifies the rector, the curate, and the church wardens who this land was given to or sold to at that time. And this picture down in the bottom right-hand corner is actually the schoolroom today. And I've found that at least since 1900, this little schoolroom has been rented out as a meeting room. And if you ever want to meet up in Bratton Clovelly today, I can rent this room for £6.50 an hour, and we can have a real good research session. So it's really interesting. Do take a good look at what you find on the buildings that still exist, as well as inside. There's actually a very nice 19th century map inside this one. The other thing I'd say about these early schools is you're likely to find mention of them in directories. That's how I know about the size of the school. You may get some early schoolmasters' names. You won't probably find the names of the children, but you'll have to use the census and find those children marked as scholars to really know exactly who is attending them. Now, if we move on to the board school, that doesn't mean boarding school. It means a school with a school board. And that was required by the 1870 Act that Kirsty talked about. And any place that didn't already have sufficient accommodation for all the 5 to 13-year-old children in the parish were required to put in place a school board and provide that accommodation. So they built a new school, opened in about 1875, and the establishment of those school boards was governed by a lot of rules, and all those rules is what gave rise to most of the records that Kirsty has mentioned. A lot of the records are locally held. Survival rates will vary, but I think wherever your school is, there must be a analogous sorts of records wherever you're situated, provided they survive. I'm really going to just give you some more specifics on a couple that Kirsty mentioned, and show you some of the excerpts from that. Kirsty was talking to you about the admission registers. These are terrific, and they hold. I have a complete run from the 1890s to 1961. And the thing that's best about all these school records is that the handwriting is so good in all of them. A lot of them's done by the schoolmaster, but they're really very easy to read, at least all the ones that I've seen. So what might you find? Of course, you'll get the names and parents. You'll get where they lived, and I even have cases where I have a mention of them living in caravans on farms, so it can get very specific. You'll get specific birth dates. You'll also get some really excellent information that Kirsty showed you briefly on what schools they came from and when and why they left. And that is really helpful if you're looking into local migration. In the case of my parish, it really contracted in size in the latter 1800s and early 1900s. And although I haven't done a lot of analysis of the migration information in these records, I'm hoping that it's really going to help me to understand a lot better exactly who left, why, and where they went to. The other thing I'll mention is it can tell you quite a bit about historical events. So if we take a look at this one, this is an excerpt from the register in the early 1940s, and I had known that there had been an evacuation from London, of the children in London during the war, out to the villages, and you can see that very clearly in this register. My own father-in-law was sent to Wales at the age of 7, so I've been aware of that. What I hadn't been aware of was that also happened from other cities, and I found by looking at this, you can see that there were also children there temporarily from Plymouth. So you'll find other things, and again, I think these registers are going to do a lot to help me understand not only kind of these national events, but also exactly what was going on that caused my own parish to reduce in size so much. And if I just briefly go back, I also wanted to mention that if you take these records, which are an excellent record of the children aged 5 to 14, and you combine them with your voter list, which at least since the 1930s will have everybody aged 21 or over, I think you get a great census substitute for the 20th century, which can be quite problematic after the census years. So take a look at these. Now if we move on, there's another set, school board minutes. And these are the monthly meetings of the school board. They are really lengthy. In fact, I've only done the first volume out of 5 volumes that are available for the board of school. And they can give you a whole lot of context on your place and on the what was going on in education. So, for example, what you see on the page here is a discussion of what they're doing to try and hire a new schoolmaster. It talks about a salary. It shows that part of his pay will be from a government grant that actually varies year on year depending on his exam results. So you can get a lot on legislation, you get a lot on the finance of the school, hiring and firing, rates and fees, and things on the school buildings and everything. If we take a little closer look at some of these, here the top one here is it's actually the start of 2 pages on attendance rules, and there was a whole lot of reasons why kids didn't have to come to school. And actually in the late 19th century the big challenge in the Bratton Covelli school was seeing if children were going to show up at all, because they were really needed on the farms. The second entry here talks about fees. So they paid a weekly fee to attend these schools, at least in the 19th century. I think later on some of that might have gone away, but it can give you not only the fees that were set, but maybe some indication information about the social structure and how they segmented the different types of people in the parish. So here you have laborers have a fee, the tradesmen and farmers have a fee. And in fact, early when the board school first opened, the tradesmen had a lower fee than the farmers. So I wonder if later in the century the farmers were facing some conditions whereby they and the tradesmen ended up paying the same amount. The last one down here is one that is actually the firing. They're voting on firing one of the schoolmasters. And I'd say the more you read about it, it's almost like football coaches in England. If you don't win the game, you're gone on a yearly basis. So these guys really could come and go. And every time I saw bad exam results come in, I would know to expect at the end of the year to see a new schoolmaster. Mm. Now another one is, Kirsty told you actually quite a few things about the logbooks. These are great. They can be quite repetitive, but I do think they're really worth the time, because I think it's in that repetition that you really start to get the feel of your place. You've got the routine stuff. So in Bratton Clovelly, it's all about the kids being out and not coming back when the hay harvests are going on, the potato tilling. They've got the holidays. They've got inspections of the school by both the Crown and the church. They also have a lot of time spent on the children who aren't attending the school, the illnesses that break out, the snowy weather that keeps those who are 3 miles away from coming to school. And the other thing that these logbooks are really good at is to really describe in detail the curriculum. Now, there's a lot of subjects that that I don't even recognize to this day. You can tell things like fractions, but some of the different types of things they were studying are really quite foreign to me. But you can get all the detail year by year group. So let's. I would say also that this is not really the kind of records for names, but it really depends on the schoolmaster. So I know I have got one schoolmaster I'm transcribing right now who goes into quite some detail. For example, about one boy he's expelled who he can quote unquote do nothing with, and about the delicate health of others. So you just kind of have to read along in these things. Now here's a few examples. This top entry talks about the schoolmaster having to change the weekly timetable through the harvest season because the older scholars are just not going to be there at the end of the weekend. The second one, I really like this one. So 2 of the children, this says the parents of 2 children won't allow them to attend school, even when the board says they may come for free, unless they're allowed besides a weekly sum for maintenance. So these parents wanted to be paid to send their child to school. And throughout these, you can really tell how important all these children were to the livelihood of their families. So I would say a lot of the latter 19th century was really on getting the parents on board with getting their children to school as much as anybody else. The last one also is a really interesting one, and this says not more than 35 children were present on any day, which is perhaps half of the number that were on the register. A great number are sick, and one of the school has died, and that was a little fellow, James Roberts, 7 years old. And then a few days later, they had to close the school for 5 weeks on account of diphtheria and scarlatina. And here's where you start combining it with things like the burial registers, and you can really see what happened that winter. But the school was a place where things like diphtheria, whooping cough, measles, and scarlet fever could really spread, and it did occasionally have to be closed for a significant period of time. Okay, let's talk about the punishment books. Now this, I don't know if there's huge historical value in here, but I can tell you these are really interesting ones. You won't want to miss out on these for just sheer human interest. There are a lot of names in them, And I think the examples I show you only have boys, but rest assured the girls were in there too. It's just that they were always caught for talking and don't make quite as interesting examples as some of the boys do. They describe the infractions and the punishments. You can find the boys who always get in trouble together, so you know who their best buddies are. And this particular page I'm showing shows a huge number of the upper class boys are out that day because they've all gone to the river, and this is pretty typical for Bratton Clovelly, where they tend to disappear together. And I'm not sure any of the older boys were there that day. Now, if we look more closely at this kind of, Kirsty, this has some parallels with some of the ones you showed. This whole group up at the top came to school late because they were out chestnut picking, and in addition, they came with unwashed hands and faces, so they each got a stroke. A little more serious, the second one. This one earned 2 strokes for slamming a desk on a girl's head. Even worse, these boys got a severe caning. It says for bullying the small boys, but I think it was really because they'd been warned with what he calls moral suasions, and they still ignored it. And the last one is probably one of my favorites, where here these 2 little fellows, they saw the hounds pass, and they ran after them, and they never did see them again that day. So that was big fox hunting country, and they got in a little trouble for that. So this is just a fun set of records. I happen to have ones from, I think, 1911 to 1936, and I think you'll really enjoy those. And now, thinking about all these troublemakers here, last weekend we were having lunch up in the parish, and we were in one of the side rooms in the Clovelly Inn, the local pub, and happened to spot this photo of the class of '37. And I thought, well, that's just the kids they're talking about in these registers. So I just say, keep an eye out. Photos of school children and school events are really tend to stay around. And if you just look around enough, whether you can visit the place or look at newspapers or the like, these may be around. In this case, this photo is really, really good because it had listed below this picture the names of all the children. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, this one was really fun. Okay, let me just take one more minute and talk about their newest school, this Bosley Cross Primary School, and that one's still running today. There's not that many records available on it because it's current information, so there's a lot of living people, and that so the privacy rules apply. And also, when it originally started, it was very small, so there's only limited information on its early years. But I went back and looked, and it turns out this school it's sitting on the edge of mine's quite a sprawling parish. This is just on the edge of it, and it was originally part of another parish in the 1800s. It was a Church of England school for Bridestow. And then later it was just a school to pick up outlying farms, and it was listed in another parish. So for those schools sitting on border locations, be sure and look into the neighboring parishes to see if you can find some records there. And I actually did find some records. There's a handful up at Kew in London that I'm going to go see next weekend. I can't wait. And actually, locally at the Devon Record Office, there's a set of attendance records that'll take me from the board school records, which stopped in 1961, up to 1974. But what's most interesting to me about this one is I then happened to just check out the newspapers, and quite a story unfolded. And it turns out that back in the 20s, there was a diphtheria outbreak at this school. And a child, I think, may have actually died. And the parents then, a rumor got going that some of the wood from the school had come from a German World War I prisoner of war camp were some of the German soldiers that had diphtheria. And the parents decided this school was really had something fundamentally wrong, and they started refusing to send their kids there. And this went on, and the school board kept doing their little environmental test and saying, nope, it's not the school, it's not the school. And then all of a sudden, one night in about 1923, the building was gone. It was destroyed by fire, and if you can see this bottom headline, it says dramatic end to controversy. I have to do a little more reading, but I'm not sure they even bothered to investigate that fire.
Wow.
But then they had a problem right after that where you see children running wild, because then they had no school at all, and they had all these children out on the farms who had no place to attend school. So anyway, this school that's sitting there now, needless to say, was built after that time. So keep an eye out and do check the newspapers for what it tells you about your schools. You may have some real surprises. The last thing I'd just like to mention is look closely. There aren't huge numbers of school records, but when you find them, look closely. In the folders at Devon Record Office for Bratton Valley, there was one sheet of newspaper, and I'm still not sure why that sheet of newspaper was kept in the records, but I turned it over and I thought this was a nice little find, and tells you a lot about the state of girls' education in 1910 when this was published. And I'll just let you know, it says the practical education of girls, the great aim in education is to equip the scholar for his or her future career. One of the surest means to this end in a girl's education is to teach her to use the Singer sewing machine. So I'm going to leave it at that, and wish you well on your discoveries. And with that, I'll turn back over, I believe, to Julie here. Okay, just one sec.
Thank you so much, Kim and Kirsty. That was a really fascinating run through education, and I think I'm quite lucky, I guess, because Surrey, which is where most of my ancestors are from, are having theirs digitalised at the moment by, I believe, Ancestry, and I'm very keenly, I'm very keenly and very impatiently waiting for them to arrive at Ancestry. I am hoping there will be some revelations in there. I know my grandmother very often said that the school inspector, who was her mother's cousin, would come to the door and she would instantly open the door and say, well, Fred, which one of my boys hasn't been to school again? Because she instantly knew that it was her kids not going to school. From my grandmother's perspective, she left school at 14 and she said it did her no harm, and she's probably quite right. But I think it's some great, what I've done whilst you guys were chatting and going through the presentation, I nipped into the community and I've put the link that one of you mentioned, the educationengland.org site, into the community. And between now and next week, when the next blog post goes up, we'll try and grab some more web addresses and some links and some other material that we can share that will be good, perhaps grounding, not necessarily for people that are researching within the United Kingdom, but perhaps it may give somebody a spur somewhere else of a record that may be relevant to their own location. I know that someone's mentioned, I think it may have been Hillary, who mentioned about pupil teachers. And I know there are some pupil teachers records for a place called Geelong in Victoria, where I have a family member who was a pupil teacher. And I don't know whether there's any of those records that have survived here. I've never needed to explore that here. So I think education records are very often seen as it's something that we've all done. We've all drifted through the education system, but we neglect to realise just the impact that perhaps it has on our history that can easily be recorded.
Julie, on the pupil teachers, I would mention in the log book, at least for Bratton Valley, there's a great deal about the pupil teacher and the pupil teacher's progress, and several cases where the teacher, the pupil did not, say, pass their exams because they were on a 5-year, basically an apprenticeship with the schoolmaster. And another one where there's quite some detail about another pupil teacher who ended up having a long-term health problem and was also asked to leave. So I think you can find quite a lot of information on the pupil teachers and other school staff, the sewing mistress, which was often a sister or wife of the schoolmaster, and those logbooks really are quite good about information on the school staff themselves.
Yeah, I was quite lucky that actually when my grandfather departed to Tenerife, he left a family tree here, and an elderly relative, we cleared out her flat, well, my parents cleared out her flat in the 1990s, and she had certificates of one of my great, how many times great, I can't remember, aunts, and the certificates of her qualifying as a teacher from the 1890s and early 1900s. And there may be some of those in archives that have been deposited in family papers, estate papers, or family documents that have been deposited rather than thrown in a skip. Yeah. So, it's certainly worth looking in places like that. And I think some of them are surname indexed. So, if you're looking for a particular name, but equally it will be in a particular place as well, perhaps. So there's certainly other things out there that, although they're not prevalent in the archives, there may be other things as well that you wouldn't normally expect to find.
Yeah, I think I'm just building on what you've said, Kirsty. Actually, I know from Surrey, the Loseley Manor, they have an estate set of papers, and there are boxes and boxes of them. And I did come across there some various references to various schools within, certainly the Godalming 100, and a few other references to them building various schools and the church's involvement. And I wasn't looking for those, I just noticed they were in the part. I was turning the pages for something else. Of course, hindsight's a wonderful thing, and you think, I wish I'd stopped and sat and looked at those things, but it's always the way. And I think that you can always find something if you know what you're looking for, or you'll listen to a hangout like this one, and it'll give you an idea. So certainly, as I was listening to Kim talking about the Scarlatina, my mum had polio when she was 4.5, and my mum very clearly remembered that she was taken out of school, obviously while she was hospitalised. There will be a record of that. I'd never occurred to her. I've spent lots of months tracking down her early medical records, with a degree of success, I have to say. But that's an idea, and it's gone on my list, that now I go to mum's education records. It's silly, because I could have asked her this at any point and didn't, and it just shows that you need to capture the people whilst we have them to extract those bits of information. Was any surprises that you found, Kim, when you were writing the presentation? Any surprises?
Oh, there was lots of surprises. I mean, these records are full of surprises. I mean, I have to say that the Bosley Cross history of that last one, that the school actually got burnt down, was a terrific surprise, and it really makes me want to go back and spend a lot more time in the newspapers on looking at what was happening with these schools. I think that is a key resource, and can tell us a lot about. It can really add to the school records themselves.
I think just in terms of what you were saying there, Julie, about getting information from people that are living now, I bought some fantastic books about 8 or 10 years ago for my parents and gave them to them for Christmas. They're called Father's Memories and Mother's Memories. And I think the company's called Priceless Treasures. And they have all sorts of, so you can do grandmother's memories or grandpa's or anybody. And they're fantastic. And they ask questions like, what was your first school called, and what was your favourite subject? Can you remember any of the teachers that you had? What was your worst subject? What secondary school did you go to? But all sorts of things, not just education. And it was fantastic. I gave them as Christmas presents one year, and I think my parents kind of had a competition of who was going to put the most photographs in, and then they would give them back to me the following Christmas. So I have them stored in my cupboard, very, very safely, because they're just literally priceless treasures. And I think that's what the company's called, because they're questions I would never dream of asking my parents, but I really want to know.
And that's what's so important, is capturing those things. And certainly I know from my own experience was that my mum and I went to the same junior school.
Wow.
And my first teacher was my mum's first teacher. And she was a really sweet, gentle lady. You could imagine her giving her whole life to teaching. An incredible lady. And Mum had a huge amount of affection for her. And I remember my first day at school, I was keen to just get off because I was just like, when I was even a boring child. I wanted to get off and start exploring and find out what was going on. And I remember this teacher hugging my mum, and I remember thinking it was weird, and it wasn't until later on, years later, that Mum said that she had been taught by that same teacher. And I have early school photos from the very early 70s, and I have all my old school reports. I have all my mum's school reports. That were rescued from a skip.
Mine in the cupboard, yeah.
Yeah. Mum was going to chuck hers out, and I said, "Oh, can I have those?" And I think she said to me, "Yes, here you go, squirrel," because Mum knows I used to like to keep everything going. So it's worth having all those things, and if you can build on it, and I'm sure when I go back and look at those reports, I shall see which subjects Mum liked and didn't like. I have a pretty good guess, but it'd be nice just to a bit of fun almost to have a guess at what she didn't like and see if the reports reflect it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's great. What about you, Kim? Have you got any old school reports?
I do. But as far as my parents, I was just sitting here laughing a little. My mother was an Army brat, and so she's got scrapbook books of attending 16 schools. So I'm not sure that I'll go down that route. But in truth, the schools I attended were in the States, and I have not. I came to family and local history a little late in life, and I have not really delved into sorts of records that might be available in the States. One thing that I really appreciate quite a bit of online is the yearbooks they've captured, which were quite a big deal in the States, and they were the books that showed the photos of everybody and their interest in the clubs they were in, and that you got all your friends to sign at the end of the year. And so quite a bit of them are online, but I would be very interested to hear from others of the sorts of records we might find in the States or in Canada, Australia, and other places, Scotland, that might be slightly different from what we're seeing here.
Yes, certainly. I'm not aware of anyone that has school books or yearbooks that we have here, like you do in the States. And in fact, I was talking to someone recently who told me that her children no longer have those pictures that we used to have as school kids, you have the whole class, because it's, I don't know, I think we've gone completely mad in terms of confidentiality and data protection, that now we've gone almost the other way, that now we've stopped capturing those earlier moments, which I think is a real shame. Of course, there is those very well-known auction site beginning with E, who also has various pictures on it in terms of school buildings and maybe pictures of kids of schools. It's always worth having a look at and seeing if your place is anything on there that's for sale. Perhaps you can, and just accessing material from other sources.
I find the problem with my parishes, it's rare as hen's teeth, anything you can get on them, so they usually cost an absolute fortune. Anything for my parishes because they're so small, so there's so few things. You end up spending an absolute bomb on the tiniest little postcard because they're so rare.
I would agree with you there. I've certainly paid more than I should have done, more than was sensible, on a postcard of Guildford in the 1880s, and it's a group of people in their Sunday best standing in the castle grounds, and I paid a lot more than would have been
more than you're prepared to disclose, Julie.
Absolutely. It was but it was one of those things that I had to have.
Yeah. Oh, I'm the same. I bought. There was a huge, great picture of a statue, and I mean, I'm saying it's this big, which I know is a bit strange when it's a screen, but it's literally about, I don't know, 4 foot by 3 foot, something like that. Maybe a little smaller than that. A picture of with a sort of border frame around it of a statue that was presented to somebody who was in the Teapot hunt, because they still have the Teapot hunt.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes. And this statue was pictured, and actually the statue went for hundreds of, well, maybe even thousands of pounds at Sotheby's. But the picture, I again spent possibly a little too much, but unfortunately the frame had already been taken off it. So I said to the guy, I'll come and pick it up from you with the frame. He said, I've already sold the frame. I had to get it reframed. But I thought, it doesn't matter. I want it.
But I do think you can look around, and it might not even be directly in the little villages themselves. It might be in a neighboring town. Like I found some things in Oakhampton and other places fairly near to Bratton Clovelly, and there are an awful lot of pictures of school children and school buildings, and so even if you can't visit, maybe you have some contacts there. I mean, we just stood in the Clovelly Inn and just asked the folks working there if we could take pictures of the photos they had on their walls, and they were quite happy to let us do so. So I think there's opportunities there.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. Well, ladies, I think we may well wrap up for this time. I'm sorry, everyone, that we've had, well, you've not had to see my face, which is down to some technical troubles. And in fact, the invite to the Google community still hasn't, in fact, come through. So I don't quite know what Google is doing, but they're obviously working on their technology. And also, we've missed Tessa this month, who runs the Hangouts with such efficiency. It puts me to shame, really. But thank you very much, Kim and Kirsty. It's been an enlightening evening, and I shall now stop the broadcast. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.